The great hall of the onyx spire was a theater of silence. Every tapestry, woven with the glorious and bloody history of the Nocturne Kingdom, seemed to hold its breath. Every shadow, long and sharp in the candlelight, was a spectator. At the head of a table that could have seated 100, but now held only one, sat King Aldrich, first of his name, ruler of all that the moon touched. He had been king for a year marked by 2 clandestine attempts to make his reign the shortest in their 800-year dynasty. Before him stood a woman, Sarah Voss. She was not old by their standards, barely a century and a half, with eyes that had seen far less than his, but somehow seemed infinitely more tired of it all. She was a daughter of a disgraced house, a name whispered with pity or contempt, now resurrected for the least glamorous, most vital role in the kingdom, royal taster. A crystal goblet, filled with a ruby-dark vintage from the sunken cellars, was presented to her on a silver tray by a servant whose hands trembled slightly. This was the ritual, the 3rd night of her service. The first 2 had been uneventful, marked only by Sarah's profound disinterest in the pageantry. She took the goblet. The court, what little of it was assembled for this grim nightly tradition, watched. Lord Valerius, Aldrich's chief adviser and a man who looked perpetually like he'd just swallowed a lemon a century ago, stood stiffly by the king's throne. Sarah did not swirl the wine. She did not inhale its bouquet. She did not hold it to the light. She raised it to her lips with the same weary enthusiasm one might reserve for paying taxes, and took a small, deliberate sip. She held it on her tongue, her expression unreadable. Aldrich watched her. He had been told she was the best. Her senses were preternaturally sharp, a quirk of her bloodline that was otherwise unremarkable. He had hired her for that singular talent. He had not been prepared for the sheer force of her apathy. It was, in its own way, more unsettling than the threat of poison. The silence stretched. It became a physical thing, pressing in on them. A full minute passed. Valerius cleared his throat, a sound like gravel turning over. Sarah finally swallowed. She placed the goblet back on the tray with a delicate click that echoed through the hall. Well? Aldrich's voice was low, a resonant baritone that had commanded armies and silenced senates. Sarah Voss met his gaze. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds. "You will live, Your Majesty." A collective sigh, barely audible, rippled through the observers. The servant took the tray and poured a glass for the king from the same decanter. Aldrich accepted the goblet. But he didn't drink. He kept his eyes on her. The first taster, a nervous old vampire named Lucian, would have bowed himself into a semicircle and backed away. Sarah just stood there, as if waiting to be dismissed from a particularly boring municipal meeting. This was the mistake. The moment the hinges of his reign and his sanity began to creak. He was curious. "And?" he asked. Sarah blinked. "And what, Your Majesty?" "The wine," Aldrich clarified, gesturing with his goblet. "What is your assessment?" Lord Valerius's jaw tightened. This was not part of the ritual. The taster's job was to ascertain the presence of wolfsbane, of silver dust, of the tears of Aethel. Not to be a sommelier. Sarah seemed to consider the question with genuine, if mild, surprise. "It's a 78 from the Valois vineyard," she said, her voice flat. "Over-oaked. The tannins have completely collapsed. It tastes like a regretful memory of a much better berry. It is, in short, safe, but tragically mediocre." Silence. This time it was not tense. It was stunned. Utterly, completely, gobsmacked stunned. Valerius looked as though she had just suggested they redecorate the hall in pastels. Aldrich stared at her. He had been raised on that vintage. His father had praised it as the pinnacle of their cellars. For 300 years, the 78 Valois had been the celebratory drink of the royal family. And this woman, this slip of a girl from a fallen house, had just dismissed it as a regretful memory. He looked down into his cup. He took a sip. She was right. It was awful. A slow, unfamiliar sensation bloomed in his chest. It felt suspiciously like amusement. He hadn't felt it in a year, not since the crown had been placed on his head and the weight of ages had settled on his shoulders. "I see," he said, his voice dangerously neutral. He set the cup down. "Thank you for your candor, Lady Voss." He used her title, a courtesy most had forgotten she was owed. "It's just Voss," she corrected, without thinking. "My family hasn't been worthy of the lady in 50 years. No need to stand on ceremony that crumbled to dust before I was born." Valerius made a small, strangled sound. Aldrich almost smiled. Almost. "As you wish. You are dismissed." Sarah gave a slight, perfunctory bow and turned, her footsteps silent on the flagstones as she departed. The king picked up his cup of tragically mediocre wine and drained it in one long swallow. "Your Majesty," Valerius began, his voice tight with disapproval. "Her impertinence is refreshing," Aldrich finished. He stood, the movement fluid and sudden. "For the first time tonight, I am certain no one is trying to poison me. Not even with flattery." He left the hall, leaving his advisers sputtering in a state of profound, aristocratic horror. In his private chambers, Aldrich stood before the grand gilded mirror above his mantelpiece, and, as always, saw nothing. No reflection. He had not seen his own face in 832 years. He relied on portraits, on the reactions of others, on the memory of a boy who had died in a forgotten century. He ran a hand over his jaw. Did he look tired? Regal? Did he look like a king? He had no idea. For the first time, he found himself genuinely wondering what Sarah Voss had seen when she looked at him. Probably, he mused, a man with terrible taste in wine. The next night, the ritual was repeated. Different vintage, same suffocating tension. Sarah took the cup, sipped, and waited. This time, however, her stillness was different. It was sharper. Her head tilted a fraction of an inch. Her nostrils flared, almost imperceptibly. Aldrich saw it. Valerius did not. She held the wine in her mouth for a second longer than before. Then, delicately, without a hint of panic, she turned and spat the mouthful into a nearby decorative urn full of sand. The gasps were audible this time. Valerius took a half-step forward. "What is the meaning of this?" Sarah ignored him, her eyes fixed on the king. "The wine is poisoned, Your Majesty." Her voice was as calm as if she were announcing a light drizzle. "Cantarella bloom, odorless to most. A faint scent of almonds if your senses are acute. And a slight oily shimmer on the surface. You'd miss it in the candlelight if you weren't looking for it." Aldrich felt a cold fury settle over him. He had survived. Again, because of her. He looked at the decanter, then at the trembling servant who had poured it, then at the guards who were now seizing the man. The servant was babbling, swearing his innocence. He was likely telling the truth. The poison would have been introduced long before it reached this hall. "Voss," Aldrich said, cutting through the rising chaos. She met his gaze, unafraid. "Are you harmed?" "The dose was for a man your size and age," she replied clinically. "The amount I took would give me a headache and an unpleasant tingling sensation for an hour. I'll live." She paused. "Which is, I suppose, the point of the job." Later, after the servant had been taken for questioning and the castle was in a state of quiet, controlled panic, Aldrich summoned her to his study. It was a vast, circular room at the top of the spire, lined floor to ceiling with books. He had read them all. Twice. Sarah entered without ceremony. She still looked pale. The tingling sensation, apparently, was more than unpleasant. "You have my gratitude," he said, gesturing to a chair. She remained standing. "You saved my life." "My contract stipulated that I should make a reasonable effort to do so," she said dryly. "Consider the terms fulfilled for the evening." He studied her. The cynicism was a shield, thick and well-worn. "Why did you take this position, Voss? Your house has grievances with the crown. My father was not kind to yours." "My house has debts," she corrected him bluntly. "Grievances are a luxury for those who can afford them. Your gold spends just as well as anyone else's. And frankly, the list of people who would hire a Voss for anything more than scrubbing floors is remarkably short. A short list and a long life make for limited career opportunities." There it was again, that brutal, unvarnished honesty. It was like a splash of cold water after centuries of cloying perfume. "I am reviewing the trade treaty with the southern clans," he said, changing the subject abruptly. He picked up a scroll from his desk, heavy with seals and intricate calligraphy. "My council advises immediate acceptance. They say the terms are generous." Sarah frowned, confused by the non sequitur. "That is not a matter for a taster, Your Majesty." "Indulge me," he said. "You've proven your senses are sharp. Perhaps your mind is as well. What do you think of a treaty that cedes the Silverwood Forest in exchange for a guaranteed supply of iron for the next 50 years? She was silent for a moment. He could practically see her mind working, weighing the risk of answering against the implicit command. Finally, she sighed. "I think your counsel is either stupid or treacherous. The Silverwood is the only natural barrier between your borders and the Fenrir wolf clans. The iron is a bribe. The southern clans get a buffer zone. The wolves get a new hunting ground. And in 50 years, when the iron runs out and your kingdom's western flank is overrun, everyone will blame the unpredictable savagery of the wolves, and not the monumental short-sightedness of the king who signed away his only defense for a pile of ore." Aldrich stared at the scroll in his hand. She had just articulated the vague, gnawing doubt in his own mind with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. His council, led by the oleaginous Duke Marius, had been unanimous. They had praised his diplomatic acumen. "They called it a masterstroke of statecraft," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "A masterstroke of giving away the farm for a handful of magic beans," Sarah scoffed. Then her eyes widened slightly as she realized who she was talking to. "Your Majesty," she added belatedly. He laid the scroll down. He felt a chasm opening at his feet. Who on his council was a fool, and who was a traitor? Duke Marius, whose lands bordered the south? Valerius, who trusted tradition above all else? He needed her. He realized it with a certainty that chilled him. He needed this abrasive, cynical, brutally honest woman more than he needed his entire fawning council. "Voss," he said. "Your Majesty?" He looked up, meeting her gaze. He was about to ask her to stay, to become more than a taster. But then he caught sight of his own sleeve. It was a new coat, tailored from deep crimson velvet, with silver thread embroidery on the cuffs. He had commissioned it to look imposing for the treaty signing. He made his second mistake. A far more dangerous one than asking about the wine. "One more thing," he said. "This coat. Does it look imposing?" Sarah's gaze dropped to the crimson velvet. Her expression was a magnificent blank canvas for a moment, and then a flicker of something, pity perhaps, crossed her features. She looked back up at his face. "Your Majesty," she said, with the careful tone of someone about to break a terrible piece of news. "It makes you look like a sentient and deeply ostentatious armchair." Aldrich blinked. An armchair? He had been going for regal predator. He had apparently landed on comfortable seating. He looked down at the silver embroidery. It did, now that she mentioned it, bear a striking resemblance to the pattern on his grandmother's favorite chaise lounge. He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. He couldn't help it. It was the first time he had laughed, truly laughed, since his coronation. The sound was rusty, foreign in the silent study. Sarah watched him, a slight frown on her face, as if she was concerned the king had finally, irrevocably snapped. "Thank you, Voss," he said, once he'd composed himself. "Your honesty is a rare and dangerous vintage. I find myself developing a taste for it." Her frown deepened. "That sounds like a terrible idea, Your Majesty." "Probably," he agreed, a genuine smile touching his lips for the first time. "You'll attend my council meeting tomorrow, 9 o'clock. Stand by the door. Say nothing unless I ask." "Am I to taste the council's arguments for poison as well?" she asked, a sliver of her usual sarcasm returning. "Precisely," Aldrich said. "I suspect they are riddled with it." He dismissed her then, and as she left the study, he felt the loneliness of the room press in on him again. But it was different this time. It was the silence after a fascinating conversation, not the endless quiet of an empty tomb. He was becoming dangerously addicted to the truth, and he had a sinking feeling it was an addiction that would cost him dearly. The small council chamber was a den of vipers pretending to be decorative statues. Duke Marius, a fleshy vampire whose jowls seemed to defy the gauntness of their kind, was pontificating about the southern clan's treaty. Lady Isolde of House Volkov, a vision in black silk with eyes like chips of obsidian, sat opposite him, her silence more menacing than Marius's blustering. And Lord Valerius, as ever, looked like he was presiding over the funeral of his own hopes and dreams. Sarah stood by the door. She had dressed in simple, severe black, making her blend into the shadows. She felt the eyes of the council members slide over her, dismiss her, and then occasionally slide back with a flicker of confusion. What was the taster doing here? "A triumph of diplomacy!" Duke Marius boomed, slapping his meaty hand on the table. "King Aldrich will be hailed as a peacemaker." Aldrich sat at the head of the table, his face an impassive mask. He had deliberately worn his most boring, functional black doublet. He felt powerfully unimposing and strangely confident. "Peace?" he said, his quiet voice cutting through the Duke's noise. "Or merely a postponement of war, purchased at a ruinous price?" Marius blinked. "Your Majesty, the terms are unprecedented." "Indeed," Aldrich agreed. "I cannot recall another time in our history when we paid a neighbor to take our most strategic natural defense off our hands." The room went cold. Lady Isolde's lips curved into a faint, cruel smile. She enjoyed chaos, so long as it wasn't her own. Valerius looked at Aldrich with open alarm. This was not how the new king was supposed to behave. He was supposed to be uncertain, to lean on their experience. "Voss," Aldrich said, without turning his head. Every head in the room swiveled towards the door. Sarah felt a dozen sets of ancient, predatory eyes lock onto her. It was like being a mouse in a room full of cats. A very unimpressed mouse. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice steady. "You have a practical mind," Aldrich said, enjoying the collective apoplexy of his council. "Explain to the Duke, in small words if you must, the flaw in his magnificent treaty." Sarah stepped forward, out of the shadows. She met Duke Marius's furious glare with a look of polite boredom. "The flaw, Your Grace," she began, her voice clear and precise, "is that you are treating a border dispute like a commercial transaction. You are selling the lock on your front door for a cartload of bricks. The bricks are lovely, I'm sure, but they won't be much use when the wolves are in your parlor." She paused. "Unless you intend to throw the bricks at them, in which case your strategy is not only flawed, but also deeply stupid." Duke Marius's face went from ruddy to a deep apoplectic purple. "This is an outrage, a slip of a girl from a disgraced house lecturing her betters on statecraft." "She is my royal taster," Aldrich said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Her job is to detect poison, and she has just identified a lethal dose in this treaty. I am inclined to trust her judgment." He picked up the scroll and with a single deliberate tear, ripped it in half. "The treaty is rejected. Send a raven to the southern clans. Tell them our silver is not for sale." He stood. "The council is dismissed." The members filed out, a maelstrom of shock, fury, and intrigue swirling in their wake. Duke Marius shot Sarah a look of pure venom. Lady Isolde gave her a slow, appraising glance, as if measuring her for a coffin. Valerius just shook his head and hurried after the king. Sarah remained by the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had just publicly humiliated one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. Her life expectancy, already professionally precarious, had just plummeted. "That was foolish," she said to the empty room. But a part of her, a part she had thought long dead, felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. The Voss family might be disgraced, but she had just spoken truth to power, and power had blinked. Aldrich found her in the armory an hour later. She was running a whetstone along the edge of a short sword with practiced ease. "Expecting trouble?" he asked, his voice echoing off the racks of steel. "I've found it's best to be prepared," she said, not looking up. After one publicly calls a duke deeply stupid, trouble tends to follow. Marius is a blowhard, his anger is performative. His assassins, I imagine, will be considerably more sincere. She tested the blade with her thumb. "Why did you do that? You made me a target." "You were already a target," he countered. "You saved my life. My enemies know who you are. The only difference is that now, my allies do too." "You have allies?" she asked, finally looking up. "From where I was standing, it looked like you had a room full of people waiting for you to fail." "I have you," he said simply. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than any sword. Sarah's practiced cynicism faltered. She had no witty retort, no sarcastic dismissal. He spoke it as a fact, plain and unadorned. "I have you." It wasn't a declaration of affection. It was a statement of strategic reality. And yet, "You have a taster, Your Majesty," she said, her voice softer than she intended. "One who is good with poisons, and apparently terrible at diplomacy." "You are the first person in a year to tell me the truth, without calculating the personal benefit," he said, stepping closer. "I don't know if that makes you a terrible diplomat, or the only one I can trust." He stopped, standing just a few feet from her. The air crackled. "I need that, Sarah." He used her first name. It was the first time. It landed like a brand. She looked away, back to the sword in her hands. "Truth is a bitter draught, Your Majesty. Most people lose the taste for it quickly." "Then you shall have to keep serving it to me," he said, "until I learn to enjoy it." Life in the Onyx Spire settled into a new, bizarre rhythm. Sarah's official duty was still to taste the king's wine every evening, a ritual now watched with a mixture of fear and fascination by the court. But her unofficial duties had multiplied. She became Aldrich's shadow, a silent presence in meetings, a sharp-eyed observer in the audience hall. He would ask her opinion at the most unexpected times. "Voss, the emissary from the Night Court, is he lying?" "Yes, he keeps touching his ear. It's a tell. Also, his proposal is nonsense." "Voss, the new tax code." "It's a disaster. It penalizes small landowners and rewards the sycophants on your council. Scrap it." "Voss, this portrait of my great-great-grandfather. Does it capture his legendary gravitas?" "It makes him look like he's smelling something foul, which, given the state of 14th century sanitation, he probably was." The court was horrified. They began to refer to her in whispers as the king's veracity, or, less kindly, the upstart Voss. Lady Isolde watched her with an unnerving, predatory focus. Duke Marius plodded in the shadows, but they could do nothing overt. The king's protection was absolute. And then came the incident with the antechamber. Sarah had appropriated a small, forgotten room near the study, It was dusty and cramped, but it had a window overlooking the city, and she claimed it as her own space, a refuge from the endless political maneuvering of the court. She spent her off hours there, reading, sharpening her blades, and enjoying the silence. One afternoon, Aldrich was striding down the corridor, his mind consumed by a dispatch from the border. He needed to ask Sarah about the subtext. He moved with the innate, thoughtless speed of his kind, a blur of motion. He turned the corner to her antechamber, reached for the door, and slammed, face first, into an invisible, immovable wall. He stumbled back, stunned. The impact hadn't hurt, but the shock of it was profound. He, king of the nocturne, had just walked into a doorframe. Or rather, the space where a doorframe was. He reached out a hand, and his fingers met a cold, unyielding barrier at the threshold. He had been so focused on his thoughts, he'd forgotten one of the fundamental laws of their existence. A vampire cannot enter a private dwelling unless invited by one who resides there. And Sarah Voss, by claiming this dusty closet as her own, had made it her dwelling. He stood there, frozen, for a full 10 seconds. The ruler of a kingdom, the commander of legions, a creature of immense power and antiquity, was locked out of a room in his own castle. By his poison taster. The sheer, unmitigated absurdity of the situation washed over him. He heard a sound from within, the soft rustle of a page turning. He knocked. It was a quiet, hesitant sound. A king does not knock. The page turning stopped. There was a pause. Yes? Sarah's voice, muffled by the thick oak door. Voss, it is the king. Another pause, longer this time. He could practically hear her smirking. And? His jaw tightened. He could command her to come out. He could order the door torn from its hinges. But that would be admitting defeat. He had to play by the rules. Her rules, in this tiny 10 by 10 patch of his own domain. I require a word with you, he said, his voice strained. I'm busy, she replied. He was going to kill her. Slowly and with immense satisfaction. It is a matter of state. A weary sigh drifted through the door. Is the kingdom on fire? No. Is anyone actively dying? Not at this precise moment, no. Then it can wait. I'm at a very good part in my book. Aldrich closed his eyes. He counted to 10, in Old Valyrian. He was the king. He had faced down armies. He had negotiated the fall of empires. He would not be defeated by a locked door and a recalcitrant employee. Sarah, he said, the name soft, a plea disguised as a command. Please, may I come in? The silence on the other side of the door was deafening. He had said please. He couldn't remember the last time he'd said please to anyone. Then he heard the scrape of a chair and footsteps. The door opened. Sarah stood there, a book in one hand, a single eyebrow arched in victory. You have to actually say it, she said, her voice laced with amusement. Say what? He growled. The words, she prompted, leaning against the doorframe. The magic words. He stared at her. She was enjoying this far too much. He took a deep breath. Sarah Voss, he said, the formal words feeling like ash in his mouth. I humbly request you invite me into your residence. Her smile was dazzling. Come in, you ridiculous man. He swept past her into the tiny room. That counts, he muttered, more to himself than to her. He turned to deliver the scathing lecture he had been composing in his head, but it died on his lips. The room was sparse, but she had made it hers. A comfortable chair, a small table, a flickering candle, and stacks of books. It was peaceful, a stark contrast to the oppressive grandeur of the rest of the castle. What was so urgent? She asked, sinking back into her chair. He had completely forgotten. The dispatch, the border, all of it had evaporated in the heat of his indignation. He stood there, the mighty King Aldrich, feeling like an intruder in his own home. He looked at her, curled up in the chair with her book, and the anger faded, replaced by something else, something warmer and far more dangerous. "I needed your opinion on the new tapestries for the gallery," he improvised lamely. Sarah looked at him, her head tilted. She knew he was lying, but she let it go. "I'm sure they're excessively large and feature one of your ancestors looking constipated on a horse. They always do." He found himself smiling. "This one is particularly constipated," he admitted. "I thought you'd appreciate it." He didn't leave. He stayed for an hour, sitting on a hard wooden stool while she read, occasionally making a dry comment about her book. The silence between them was comfortable, easy. For the first time, he understood what it felt like not to be the king. He was just Aldrich, and it was terrifyingly pleasant. The state dinner for the delegation from the northern principality of Glacis was Aldrich's personal hell. The prince was a 700-year-old boar who had one story, about a boar hunt in 1532, which he told on a loop. The food, a lavish spread designed to impress the human attachés of the delegation, smelled divine and was utterly inedible to any vampire present. Aldrich's job was to preside over this farce with regal grace. Sarah stood behind his chair, her official duty to taste his wine. Her unofficial duty, it turned out, was to keep him from falling into a boredom-induced coma. The prince was halfway through his boar story for the third time. And the beast, its eyes filled with a furious fire, charged. "I had naught but my wits and a small paring knife." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her lips barely moving. "I'm rooting for the boar," she whispered, her voice a ghost in his ear. Aldrich choked back a laugh, disguising it as a cough. He took a sip of his wine, a crisp, flinty white that Sarah had approved with a single, non-committal nod. The dinner dragged on. Under the cover of the table, Sarah began passing him tiny, folded notes. "The princess is trying to set your sleeve on fire with her mind. I think she's succeeding." Aldrich glanced at the sullen-looking princess. She was indeed glaring at his arm with intense concentration. Another note. "If you have to listen to the boar story again, feign a seizure. I'll back you up." He scribbled a reply on his own napkin. Tempting, but the diplomatic fallout would be extensive. "Worth it," came the immediate reply. It was during the main course, a roasted pheasant that smelled agonizingly good, that Lady Isolde made her move. She had been watching the subtle interplay between the king and his taster with mounting fury. "Lady Voss," she said, her voice carrying across the table, dripping with false sweetness. "You seem so underutilized, standing there all evening. Tell me, is it terribly dull, watching others enjoy the bounty of the king's table?" The question was a deliberate cruelty, a reminder of what they were, what they couldn't have, a reminder of Sarah's lowly station. The table fell silent. Everyone turned to look at Sarah. She didn't flinch. "On the contrary, Lady Isolde," Sarah replied, her voice cool and even. "It's a fascinating anthropological study. For instance, I've learned that the more pompous the vampire, the more delicately they pretend to push their food around their plate. You, my lady, have arranged your peas into a rather lovely defensive fortification. Are you expecting them to charge?" A few of the younger vampires failed to hide their snickers. Isolde's face became a mask of cold fury. The Prince of Glacis, oblivious, chose that moment to launch into his boar story again. The tension was broken. Aldrich shot Sarah a look of pure, unadulterated gratitude. She had not only defended herself, she had done it with a wit that left Isolde disarmed and ridiculous. Later that night, long after the disastrous dinner had concluded, he found her in the library. She was perched on a rolling ladder, retrieving a book from a high shelf. "Defensive pea fortification?" he said, leaning against a bookshelf. She glanced down at him, a small smile playing on her lips. She started it. She did, he agreed. And you finished it. You have a talent for making enemies, Voss. It's a gift, she said, pulling a heavy leather-bound tome from the shelf. She started to climb down. Allow me, he said. He was beside the ladder in an instant, his hand offered to help her. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, then placed her hand in his. His skin was cool, hers was not warm, not in the human sense, but alive. A current passed between them, a jolt of awareness that had nothing to do with statecraft or poison. He helped her down the last few steps, but neither of them let go. They stood there in the silent, moonlit library, their hands clasped. My father, she said suddenly, her voice quiet. He wasn't a traitor. He was just honest, like me. He told your father, the late king, that his military strategy in the Western Reaches was flawed. He was right. The king lost 2 legions, but it was easier to blame my father's treasonous advice than his own arrogance. He stripped our house of its titles, its lands. He made our name into a curse. Aldrich tightened his grip on her hand. He remembered the story, vaguely, a footnote in his father's long, bloody reign. I did not know. No one does, she said, a profound weariness in her voice. History is written by the victors and the wealthy. We were neither. She finally pulled her hand away, clutching the book to her chest like a shield. I took this job to repay our debts, to try and claw back some small measure of honor for my name. I didn't expect— What? He prompted gently. She looked up at him, her storm cloud eyes searching his face. I didn't expect the king to be different. He had ruled for a year. He had been praised, feared, flattered, and plotted against. But no one had ever called him different. The word landed in his soul and took root. The loneliness, he found himself saying. The words coming from a place he kept locked away even from himself. That is the true curse of being a king, and of this endless life. You are surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. You watch centuries turn to dust. Everyone you know, everyone you could ever care for, they are finite. They leave, and you remain. He looked at her. The silence is the worst part. She held his gaze, her own cynicism for once stripped away, revealing the vulnerable soul beneath. Your Majesty, she whispered. The silence is terrifying. In that moment, they were not a king and his taster. They were 2 lonely people standing in a library full of dead men's stories, finding a flicker of life in each other. He had hired her to keep him alive, but it was only now that he realized she was doing something far more profound. She was making him feel like living was worthwhile. And across the castle, in her own opulent chambers, Lady Isolde came to a similar, though far more sinister, conclusion. The king was changing. The uncertain, grieving boy who had taken the throne was being forged into a true monarch, and the Voss girl was the fire. She was not his weakness. She was his strength. And she had to be removed. The poison was a work of art, subtle, patient, and cruel. It wasn't the swift, clumsy violence of Cantarella Bloom. This was called silver ash, a rare compound distilled from blighted mountain flowers that grew only on silver-rich soil. It didn't kill, not at first. It mimicked a natural blood sickness, a slow degradation of a vampire's immortal vitality. It caused tremors, weakness, a dulling of the senses. Over the course of a week, it would make its victim seem fragile, flawed, their bloodline weak. Eventually, the heart would simply stop. It was Isolde's favorite, so much more elegant than a dagger in the dark. She paid a kitchen boy, a human with gambling debts, to add a single colorless drop to the decanter of water Sarah kept in her antechamber. Not the king's wine, never the king's wine, which was now guarded more fiercely than the crown jewels. This was personal. This was for Sarah. The first sign was a tremor in Sarah's hand as she reached for the king's goblet during the evening ritual. She stilled it instantly, hoping no one had noticed. But Aldrich noticed everything she did. He saw the fleeting flicker of weakness, the slight pallor beneath her already pale skin. He dismissed it as fatigue. The next day, she dropped a book in the library. The heavy tome hit the floor with a cannon-like boom. She swayed on her feet, clutching the shelf for support as a wave of dizziness washed over her. "Sarah?" Aldrich was at her side in an instant, his hand on her arm, steadying her. "Are you well?" "Fine," she lied, pushing herself upright. "Just tired." But vampires didn't get tired. Not like that. They felt the ennui of ages, the weariness of the soul, but their bodies were tireless machines. This was something else. This was wrong. The third night she nearly failed the tasting. She sipped the wine, and for a terrifying second, her senses, usually so sharp they could distinguish the vintage, the vineyard, and the mood of the vintner, told her nothing. It was just liquid. A fog had rolled into her mind. Panic flared, cold and sharp. She focused, pushed through the haze with sheer force of will, and finally, the familiar notes of the wine resolved themselves. Safe. She nodded at Aldrich, her face a pale, strained mask. "It is safe, Your Majesty." He stared at her, his eyes narrowed. He knew. He didn't know what, but he knew something was deeply wrong. He dismissed the court with a wave of his hand. When they were alone in the vast, empty hall, he walked over to her. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and took her hand. It was cold, colder than it should be. And it was trembling, a fine, persistent tremor she couldn't control. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know," she whispered, fear finally breaking through her composure. "I've felt weak for days." He led her to his study, his grip on her arm firm, proprietary. He sat her in a chair and began to pace, his mind racing through ancient texts, half-forgotten lore, the lessons of his tutors from centuries past. Tremors, weakness, a dulling of the senses, a blood sickness, or... He stopped pacing. He turned to face her. "Silver ash," he breathed, the name a curse on his lips. He had read of it in a grimoire from the Shadow Wars. A poison designed to look like a natural failing, a coward's weapon. Sarah's eyes widened in understanding and horror. It wasn't a flaw in her bloodline. It was an attack. Someone had bypassed his taster and poisoned her directly. The irony was so bitter it was almost funny. The composed, dignified King Aldrich vanished. In his place stood something ancient and terrifying. His eyes, usually a cool, thoughtful gray, blazed with a white-hot fury. The temperature in the room dropped. The candles flickered as if in a gale. "Who?" he snarled, the word a physical blow. It was not a question. It was a sentence. He moved, a blur of black. The castle was locked down before the guards even knew what was happening. Gates slammed shut. Corridors were sealed. He swept through the halls like a storm of vengeance, his quiet fury more terrifying than any shouting. He burst into the council chamber, where the members were still gathered, gossiping about the king's strange behavior. "My taster has been poisoned," he announced, his voice like the cracking of a glacier. "Here, in my home, under my protection." He let the words sink in. Duke Marius looked uneasy. Lady Isolde arranged her features into a mask of shocked concern. "This is a direct assault upon the throne itself," Aldrich continued, his gaze sweeping over each of them, weighing them, judging them. "Whoever is responsible is in this room. You will find them for me. You will bring them to me, or I swear on the soul of my father, I will unmake this entire court stone by stone. I will tear down the houses of my enemies and I will salt the very earth where they stood. You have until dawn." He turned and was gone, leaving a wake of pure, unadulterated terror. He had never spoken to them like that. The boy king was gone. A dragon had awakened. He returned to the study to find Sarah slumped in the chair, her breathing shallow. The poison was accelerating. "The antidote," he said, his voice now tight with a desperation that terrified him. "There is an antidote, mandrake root and powdered pearl, mixed in a base of purified spring water." He was rattling off the recipe from a text he'd read 400 years ago. He dispatched a guard with frantic, precise instructions. He knelt before her, taking her cold hands in his. "Stay with me, Sarah," he commanded, his voice raw. She opened her eyes, her gaze unfocused. "So much trouble," she murmured. "For a taster." "You are not a taster," he said fiercely, his grip tightening. You are the only true thing in this entire cursed kingdom." He looked at her pale, beautiful face, and the centuries of control he had mastered finally broke. The fear he felt was a physical agony, the fear of losing her, the fear of the silence returning, the deep, eternal, crushing silence she had finally filled. "The silence in my own head," he confessed, his voice breaking. "It was deafening before you started talking back to it. Do not leave me alone in it again, Sarah. I command you." Her lips curved into a weak smile. "A king shouldn't have to command," she whispered. "He should ask." Tears he hadn't shed in centuries burned behind his eyes. "Then I am asking," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Don't leave me." Her eyes fluttered closed. He held her hand, his mind a maelstrom of fear and rage, and waited for the dawn, and for the antidote that might save the only thing in his long, lonely life that had ever truly mattered. The antidote worked. Slowly, agonizingly, it worked. The tremors subsided, the fogginess in Sarah's mind receded, and the unnatural cold in her veins was replaced by the familiar cool stillness of her own blood. She spent 2 days recovering in her antechamber, now guarded by 2 of Aldrich's personal guard, the most stoic and deadly vampires in the spire. Aldrich did not leave her side. He sat on the uncomfortable wooden stool, a silent, brooding sentinel. He canceled all appointments. He ignored all missives. The kingdom could burn for all he cared. The only thing that mattered was the steady rise and fall of her chest. Emotion so subtle in their kind it was almost imperceptible. But to him, it was the rhythm of the entire world. On the 3rd day, she was strong enough to sit up and glare at him. "You look terrible," she said, her voice raspy but sharp. He hadn't slept, of course. None of them did. But he felt the weight of the last 72 hours of wakefulness more than he'd felt the last 72 years. "And you look like you've been poisoned," he retorted, the familiar banter a balm to his frayed nerves. "You need to find who did this," she said, her expression turning serious. "Your display of theatrical fury was impressive, I'm sure, but it won't solve anything. They'll just hide." "They can't hide from me," he growled. "Not in my own home." "No," she agreed, "but you're looking for a conspirator with a dagger. You should be looking for a socialite with an opportunity." She closed her eyes, thinking back. The state dinner. Everything was chaos. The prince's story, my argument with Lady Isolde. Everyone was distracted. She remembered the kitchen boy, the human one. He had refilled her water pitcher just after her exchange with Isolde. He had been nervous, his hands shaking. At the time, she'd assumed it was because of the general tension. Now, "The kitchen boy," she said, "the one with the bad haircut. He refilled my water." Aldrich was gone before she finished the sentence. They found the boy huddled in the pantry. He confessed everything in a torrent of terrified tears. Lady Isolde had paid him. She had given him the vial, told him it was just a sleeping draught to teach the arrogant taster a lesson in humility. He had no idea it was poison. Aldrich listened to the confession, his face like carved stone. He didn't harm the boy. He simply had him thrown out of the castle, his life spared but his future ruined. The real target was Isolde. He convened the court in the throne room. It was not a trial. It was a judgment. Lady Isolde was brought before him. She was defiant, her head held high, wrapped in a mantle of aristocratic arrogance. "You stand accused of high treason," Aldrich said, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "Of attempting to murder a member of my personal household. Of an attack on the crown itself." "The accusations of a sniveling human boy?" she scoffed. "Against a daughter of House Volkov? You have no proof." "I have the boy's confession," Aldrich said calmly. "And I have this." He held up the vial, which his guards had recovered from her chambers. Isolde's composure finally cracked, a flicker of fear in her eyes. "A vial that could have been planted?" "Perhaps," Aldrich conceded. "But I don't need proof. I am the king." He leaned forward on his throne, his power a palpable force in the room. "For 800 years, my family has ruled this kingdom. We have done so not just through strength, but through certainty. When our enemies reveal themselves, we do not hesitate. We do not waver." He looked at her, and she saw not the uncertain new king, but the collected fury of a dozen generations of monarchs. "You thought Sarah Voss was my weakness," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential, lethal whisper. "You were wrong. She is my clarity. She is the truth in a court of lies. And you tried to extinguish that. For that, there is no forgiveness." He didn't need to pronounce a sentence of death. His judgment was far more poetic and far more cruel. "You are stripped of your titles, your lands, your name. You are in exile. You will leave my city by sunrise and never return. You will wander the lonely places of this world with nothing but the memory of your own treachery. Live a long life, Isolde. Live with what you have done." For an immortal, it was a fate worse than death. To be cast out, alone, into the endless, unchanging centuries. She was dragged from the hall, screaming curses that no one heard. Duke Marius, who had been a silent co-conspirator, quietly abdicated his titles the next morning and retired to his country estate, a broken man. The message was clear. The king's veracity was not to be touched. A week later, life had returned to a semblance of normalcy, or what passed for normalcy in the Onyx Spire. Sarah stood before the king in the great hall for the evening ritual. She took the goblet, sipped the wine. The flavor was exquisite, a perfect balance of fruit and earth, with a clean, crisp finish. Her senses were sharper than ever. She held the wine on her tongue, then swallowed. "Well?" Aldrich asked, a hint of a smile in his eyes. Sarah met his gaze. The silence stretched, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. "It's safe, Your Majesty," she said. She paused, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "And it's quite good." He took his own glass, his eyes never leaving hers. "I had the entire cellar catalogued and reorganized according to your, brutally honest, assessments." "A wise decision," she approved. "There were some truly criminal vintages down there." "I also have a proposal for you," he said, setting his wine down. He held up a scroll. "Not a treaty, a royal decree." "If it involves new tapestries, I'm not interested," she said. "It doesn't," he assured her. "I am creating a new position in this court, that of royal advisor. The role will require a sharp mind, an incorruptible nature, and a complete inability to flatter me. The advisor will have my ear, my trust, and my absolute protection. The title comes with a restoration of all lands and honors to the House of Voss. Sarah stared at him, speechless. Everything she had worked for, everything her family had lost, offered to her in a single stroke. "You want to make your poison taster your chief advisor?" she finally managed to say. "The court will have a collective aneurysm." "Let them," he said with a shrug. "I find I no longer care for the opinions of liars and fools. I only care for the opinion of one person." He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "What do you say, Sarah? Will you help me rule this kingdom? Will you be the truth at my side?" She looked at the scroll, then back at his face. She saw the king, yes, but she also saw the lonely man underneath. The man who had been adrift in the endless ocean of immortality until she had become his anchor. Her cynical heart, the one she had guarded so fiercely for a century, finally, completely surrendered. "On one condition," she said, her voice steady. "Name it. You have to get rid of that crimson velvet coat. For good. Burn it." Aldrich threw his head back and laughed. It was a full, genuine, joyous sound that echoed through the great hall, chasing away the last of the ancient shadows. It was the sound of a king who had not only found his crown, but his heart. "Consider it done," he said, his eyes sparkling. "Advisor." She smiled. "Your Majesty." And for the first time, the words felt not like a title, but like an endearment. The beginning of a new story, one they would write together, one brutally honest conversation at a time.